next on Book TV Afterwards with guest host, professor, and commentator Marc Lamont Hill. This week, Jeff Chang and his latest book, Who We Be, The Colorization of America. In the book, the author of Can't Stop, Won't Stop examines the idea of racial progress and discusses how race is viewed today in an increasingly diverse America. This program is about an hour.
Jeff Chang, it's always good to see you, man. Talk to me about this book, Who We Be. Why this book? Why now?
Why this book? Why now? Well, the why now wasn't up to me, actually. We were looking at trying to get this book out in 2009, 2010, but it ended up taking much longer to write, and I can go into why a little bit later. But the book is about the colorization of America, which is my term for looking at the demographic changes that we've seen over the last half century and the cultural shifts that have accompanied it.
Yeah. When you say the colorization, this is a term that you use in the book that I found really fascinating. What does that mean exactly?
It's meant to capture a lot of the cultural shifts that have occurred. And I'm really interested in looking at the way that artists have actually changed the way that we see each other and how we can live together. Yeah. So, you know, it's looking into the metaphor of seeing, how we see race, and using that as a way to ask the question, how far have we really progressed over the last half century?
When I hear the word colorization, it suggests that there was a moment where color wasn't as central.
Right.
And now it is. But you're saying something a little more nuanced than that, something more complicated, because color's always mattered. Even in the book, you talk about
Absolutely.
the ways that race and color have always mattered. So what does it mean for a nation to become colorized?
So I think, you know, what we saw up through the civil rights movement was in some ways what Vijay Iyer calls sort of the aurality of race. That race was seen largely in black and white, that you had one way of being American, and that through the aurality of race you could build empathy. And so this is the way he theorizes perhaps that folks began to understand the African American struggle was through the music, right? And you and I both come from this kind of a background, this sort of hip hop, soul, funk type of background, right? So it makes a lot of sense to me. But after the Civil Rights Act passes, the Voting Rights Act, the Immigration Nationality Act, that kind of goes to the side, and visuality, seeing, becomes a much, much more important way of understanding race. And so what we see now in the US is cultural desegregation. But what's maybe in our blind spots is that we have rising rates of resegregation, of gaps in wealth and income and housing, home ownership, and educational attainment. Yeah. So it's sort of a paradox. We have both cultural desegregation happening and racial resegregation, cultural inequity increasing at the same time.
Let me take a step back for a minute, because
Sure.
you talked about orality, the orality of race, and how we shift from the oral to the visual. What's at stake when we make that kind of a shift? Because it's not purely a shift that's an advantageous one. There was some value to the previous moment as well that we
Absolutely.
lose. Talk to me about that.
Well, you know, race begins, I say in the book, between appearance and the perception of difference. Like, it's not biological. We can agree with that. It's something that's a construct, right? That's something that we think about when we see. And so when you attach difference, visual difference, to these systems of inequality, of freedom, of slavery, of containment, and freedom, and so on and so forth, that's when we start seeing the kinds of problems that all the artists that we've come to so dearly love talk about, all the way from, you know, the turn of the century all the way up through now, artists of color. And of course, Ralph Ellison summed it up, right? He talked about invisibility and invisible man. Now we have questions of visibility, which complicates things a lot. And so these are the kinds of things that we're talking about now. Invisibility, underrepresentation, but at the same time, visibility and what it means.
And perhaps even hypervisibility. I mean,
hypervisibility.
One of the things you get into the book sort of implicitly and at times explicitly is this idea of hypervisibility.
Yeah.
There's the way in which certain types of colorized or racialized images become almost ubiquitous, and they serve a kind of dangerous function in terms of how the world imagines race, how the world imagines difference. And how do we strike that balance between, you know, wanting visibility, not wanting to be invisible in the public imagination, but not wanting our visibility to become a social demerit, and not wanting our visibility to become something that becomes more problematic for the racial contract?
Ooh, that's a really difficult question. It's, I think, a question that artists are struggling with every single day, right?
Yeah.
But it's certainly, and it's something that we as folks who are interested in change and racial progress think about all the time. It's something that we talk with our students about. all the time. I think that's really the third rail of trying to be an artist of color at this particular moment.
Yeah.
Is trying to figure out how to negotiate between the need to be able to represent yourself, right, and sort of and tell your story, and the difficulty of dealing with the images that kind of precede you, right? It's the burden of representation is what it is. And it's no different than artists of color had before. But now the burden is changed, and it's much, it's maybe a lot more difficult to negotiate in a lot of different cases.
No, absolutely. Now, in the book, you divide your book up into periods. And when I first read it, I was trying to figure out what your sort of logic was for the divisions.
Okay.
You didn't divide it, for example, by presidential administrations, which is what I expected. Then I said, well, yeah, because I mean, there'd be an interesting sort of distinction between a kind of Reagan moment and a Clinton moment and now an Obama moment.
Right.
But you have like a 63 to 79 kind of thing, and then you have like a 79 to 92 kind of thing. So it's overlapping. It transcends partisan difference.
Right.
What is the underlying sort of framework or the underlying movement or impetus for how you understand these different moments in colorization?
Yeah, that's another great question. I wanted to proceed as a cultural history, spoken about through the eyes of the artists who are trying to make change. And so, so it's interesting that you had said that you expected it to proceed by presidential administration. I think that's the way that a lot of histories of race have been written.
Exactly.
Right? And this was meant to be a different kind of thing. And so I wanted to talk about the moments of the civil rights, the peak of the civil rights era, to the beginning of the 80s, as a period in which artists were struggling with underrepresentation, with invisibility. So artists like Maury Turner, who was the first African-American syndicated cartoonist, comes out with the first comic strip that's multicultural, really a cast of Peanut-style kids, but they're multiracial, and trying to imagine, right, what a post-segregated America could look like. So after the civil rights revolution begins to dismantle the laws that have mandated segregation, you still have to imagine what a post-segregated future is going to look like, and this is where the artists enter. So artists like Maury Turner, artists like the Spiral Collective here in New York City, that then becomes the core group that launches protests against the major museums in New York City in the 60s and the 70s to get into the halls of the institutions of visibility, right? And then we move into the 80s, which becomes the era of the culture wars, the rise of multiculturalism as an avant-garde, and then the backlash that we see coming from conservatives, both, I'd say cultural conservatives, both liberal cultural conservatives as well as conservative cultural conservatives, right? Folks who are Democrats and Republicans, in other words, who are against the notion that there could be more than one way of understanding how to become an American.
Right.
And so multiculturalists had a radical idea, and they thought that America had always been made up of multiple cultures, and that people could have all of these different ways of living and being, and that the exchange was what made America vital. And this was a really threatening idea, and so this is where the culture wars begin to occur. And then you see, I think, in the 90s, in the mid-90s to now, this era in which multiculturalism becomes sort of a fait accompli. Like, it becomes sort of something where the institutions, corporate institutions, government institutions begin to say, yeah, we're all multiculturalists now. This is a famous line of cultural conservatives.
You say in the book you call it a platitude. You say multiculturalism has become a platitude. Yes. I wondered about that.
Yeah?
I mean, not that I disagree necessarily. I mean, one could read that as cynical.
Yeah.
How do you make sense of that? Because you could argue that now in 2014, multiculturalism looks different, but that it's still a dominant logic. It's still a sincere attempt by many people, not all people. Obviously, corporations have their own interests, regardless of whatever. But multiculturalism is still alive and well and vibrant in terms of the goal to democratize and colorize America.
Yeah, I think that you could say that, and you could also say that it's been emptied of its radical meaning, right? This is a movement that meant to be able to foster cultural inequity. The basic idea was that if we are able to have the stories of underrepresented people told, that this would create empathy. And out of empathy would come a new consensus for racial justice and a society in which people could be free to be who they be. You know what I mean?
Right.
So we haven't necessarily gotten, I think, to that point yet.
Why though? Is it because of? So there are some who do argue that we won the culture wars, right? That's not even a debate anymore, right? That we understand that multiculturalism is America.
Right.
The debates now are a little different, and some people say because we've won the culture wars, it's kind of like Obama winning an election and people not becoming activists anymore. It's like the idea that we won, so we're sitting back. Then others are saying that there are more sort of concerted set of economic and political pieces of machinery that are making multiculturalism more empty and emptied of its revolutionary possibility.
Yeah, I think that it's both at the same time, right? On the one hand, multiculturalism certainly reset the boundaries of civility, which I think is a lot of the stuff that we were arguing as students in the 80s when we were like the first group of, 80s and 90s, when we were the first group of kids coming onto campuses that were part of, in some instances, a majority-minority entering class. I was part of the first class at Cal that was majority-minority, which who knows what majority-minority means anyways, and we'll come back to that, I'm sure. Yeah. But we, at that time, were like, I don't want to be on campus and having to deal with all these racial microaggressions, is what they call it now, right? But basically, racial incidents, being called slurs on the street, being made to feel like you don't belong in the classroom. All of these different types of things are happening during the 80s, and it resets the bounds of civility so that now the language that even reactionaries need to use has to be couched in multicultural terms, right? Pat Buchanan has this amazing piece in his book about, will America survive 2025? And he talks about how everybody can enjoy ethnic foods, right?
Yeah.
So, we all like to go out and have Thai food and Ethiopian food and that kind of thing. Yeah. Let's just keep it at that, though. Right. You know what I mean? And you just sort of like, whoa, that's really interesting. And so, multiculturalism has reset the bounds of civility, but yet we still are at a point where we can't have these conversations about the inequities and the inequalities that persist and that are actually rising. This is, again, our blind spot, our huge blind spot. And so the book was trying to really kind of get at that. On the one hand, you have folks working in the culture assiduously to promote these new visions of what the U.S. can look like. But for us to get to that particular point, we have to deal with these inequalities. There was a poll that came out after Ferguson, and two questions were asked. They were interviewing blacks and they were interviewing whites. The first question was, do the events in Ferguson raise issues that ought to be discussed about around race? Yeah. And the second question was, do the events in Ferguson draw too much focus and attention to the issue of race? And there's a big split, right? So African Americans, blacks say, overwhelmingly, this raises issues that we ought to be talking about. And for whites, there's a plurality, maybe not a majority, but there's still this feeling of, well, we're paying too much attention to race right now. So one set of folks' invitation to have a conversation is another set of folks' cue to leave the room. Yeah. So we have these gaps, not just in wealth, in income, in housing, in education, but also in the way that we talk about race. And if we can't get to those questions, then we're looking at a 2042, right, when we're all minorities. Yeah. That could be much, much worse than we're seeing right now.
To what extent is that willful neglect and ignorance of white Americans? We don't want to think about this because it makes us uncomfortable. And to what extent is it we really feel like we resolved this in the 80s? Look, there's Multicultural Day at school. Every February we eat Asian food and Indian food and have these broad sweeping terms. Yeah. And, we've done it. Yeah. We're exhausted. So to what extent is it each of those things?
I think it's both happening at the same time. So there was a set of really interesting studies in 2007. I think Vanderbilt University did this massive survey of parents and looked at parenting styles and whether parents had the conversation with their young children about race. And so 75% of white parents did not talk to their kids, their young kids, about race. Whereas parents of kids of color, so this could be, you know, mixed race marriages as well, or mixed race kids as well, 2 to 5 times as many conversations about race as white parents, right? And then earlier this year, in 2014, there was a David Binder and MTV poll that was done. And they looked at it and they said, you know, how do you feel we should be thinking about race? And it was really interesting. Millennials, who are the ones who were surveyed here, said both that colorblindness was the way that we ought to be looking at race, but that we also have to be respecting difference. So this is the legacy of the 80s. This is the legacy of the culture wars. It's contradictory. It's both sides of the culture wars, right? You have on the right this notion of putting out colorblindness as a way to roll back racial justice policies, right? And then on the other side, you have this multiculturalism that's being put out by, you know, folks who are seeming to be radical at the moment, saying we should be respecting difference. But the nut and bolt question that really was powerful to me was, how do you feel about having a conversation with people about racial bias? And no, we're not talking about racial inequality or discrimination. We're just talking about racial bias. And only 1 in 5 millennials felt comfortable having that conversation. So we're confused. Yeah. We're confused. And this gets sort of brought back in every generation. Yeah. This sort of notion of colorblindness gets brought back in every generation. And it has these very disturbing kinds of effects. I think that many parents, many white parents, are of very goodwill. They say, look at what happened in the past. When we talked about race in the past, we did it to hold people down. So if we just don't talk about it with our kids, then the kids will grow up in this society in which we'll have moved beyond that. And I think that that's willful, and it's also maybe good-willed, right? Yeah. But I feel like our history doesn't allow us that racial innocence.
They would say history's on their side, though. They would say that my great-grandparents were racist, my grandparents were probably racist, my parents were, they had their thing, I'm not racist, my kids don't even like to think about race. If we just keep dying off and having new kids, eventually the race thing will be solved. I mean, that's sort of the narrative, right? And that's how they imagine this.
And I think every generation, has been called the most diverse generation ever, right? And so if the last generation dies and the next generation comes in to place, that everything will magically be solved, right? And it's magical thinking. It is magical thinking. It is a thing of, if we just ignore inequality, it'll go away. And that's not how anything works in society. So here we are, 50 years, right, after, more than 50 years after Brown v. Board, after the Civil Rights Revolution, and we see segregation reaching these levels that were pre-Brown versus Board of Education, even as the U.S. is diversifying at an astonishing rate. And we're moving towards 2042 at a fast clip.
Well, let's unpack that inequality thing, because I think you're raising something that's interesting, and you do this in the book. And I just want to disentangle it a bit. Okay. Because on the one hand, there's racial bias. There's the issue of individual sort of ill will toward people, our individual prejudice. And maybe even some broader kind of collective notions of who people are and what they are. Then on the other hand, you're also talking about lack of access to stuff, resources, housing, healthcare, living wages, et cetera.
Culture,
right. Yeah. And how, well, that's my question, sort of how does culture play into each of those things? Because people understand racial bias linked to culture. I'm not sure that it's intuitive for everyday people to understand the link between culture and structural stuff.
Right. And I think that that's partly the work of what folks like you and me and a lot of our colleagues are doing, is trying to relate the two together. But what we say is that cultural change precedes political change. A lot of us who are working in this sort of area, that you have to have the imagination, particularly now during this period in which politics is hamstrung, is stalemated, to be able to imagine change is really, really crucial for us to be able to move to the place where we can build, very healthy movements for change. So, but getting back to sort of the question that you're talking about here, I think that it's important for us to be able to foster a culture that points towards racial justice, that artists, that creative folks, that folks who are working in the culture should be uncovering our blind spots for us.
Yeah.
And we ought to allow them to be able to do that. And then we ought to be bringing those images into, you know, the culture that we're all working in. And it's a process, right? It's not the kind of thing where you kind of press a lever and then change happens. This is something that builds over time. And so all of the things that are happening on Twitter right now, even as we're speaking, right?
Yeah.
All the stuff that's happening on Facebook right now, right? All the stuff that's happening all throughout the country in these sort of interventions that people are making, they all add up to something. And that might sound crazy, optimistic, and hopeful, but you know, I think that it was really interesting to look at the 2008 election and the explosion of street art that happened. You had this Obama Hope poster, right, that Shepard Fairey had put together, and that gets out there into the ether, and then suddenly you have this explosion of images of people wanting change. And so a lot of stuff is now spilling outside of the Democratic agenda and Barack Obama's platform. But it's images of the Third World Liberation Front, like Reborn. It's images of environmental justice. It's images of immigrant rights. It's images of all of these different types of things that the Democrats, and taking positions that the Democrats aren't taking, much less the Republicans. But at that particular point, what we saw was attached to this symbol of change, this Obama now not as a politician, but as a symbol of change, are all these other folks putting up their symbols of change as well. And that's a moment at which all of this imagination is coming forth, and that allowed, I think, in a lot of respects, this wave to build that resulted in Barack Obama's election. Now, I'm not saying that elections are going to be the end-all and be-all. In fact, we can see...
We see they're not, right?
We can see, like, yeah, absolutely. We can see what happened was in 2009 that the culture wars flare up again, right? That the symbol of Obama as a symbol of change becomes twisted. You have the Obama Joker
Which
image.
is another interesting thing you talk about in the book,
Mm-hmm.
you know, sort of how that figure comes out.
Right.
Unintended, right? But that's how art is all the time.
No,
right?
I think it, well, yeah,
I mean,
it was
the
partly
initial,
initially
the initial
unintended.
image wasn't, and then
Right.
the idea of attaching the socialist and all the other stuff to it,
Right.
it took a life of its own.
Right. So the story is, right, that there's a Palestinian American who is trying to learn Photoshop.
Right.
Right. So he takes the cover of Obama from Time magazine, and he does him up as Heath Ledger's Joker in the Batman, right? And just posts it on his Flickr account, and wakes up like a couple months later to find that socialism has been put at the bottom of this poster, and it's been posted all over Los Angeles, which is where the Obama Hope poster made its debut as well.
Right.
And suddenly there's Obama as a socialist, and then there's Obama as the foreigner, the Kenyan, right? And so on and so forth. And Obama now is a symbol of all the fears, the sum of all fears, as opposed to the sum of all hopes. And so that's just the image war, right? But what you also see is the conservative movement is very smart about targeting people within the Obama administration right away who have an understanding about hip-hop, about hip-hop's impact on young people, and about culture and the role of culture in being able to move people around different kinds of ideas and policies. And so immediately, you know, Yossi Sargent, Van Jones, they're drummed out of the administration. Right. Immediately, what we see is the Shirley Sherrod incident. We see Obama making comments about Henry Louis Gates being racially profiled in his own doorstep, and he's hammered for that. And so...
Which is ironic on its own. I mean, Henry Louis Gates...
It's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many layers of irony to that. From Henry Louis Gates being the kind of one of the key figures in the culture wars of the 80s, and then being the kind of target of these kind of new culture wars of the 2000s. Or 80s and 90s, I should say. But what's interesting to me, and it brings two questions up for me. One is sort of the culture wars that exist now are being prosecuted in very different ways. In the 60s and the 50s, it was the claim of neutrality, right? That culture is just this thing. America is just this thing, right? And then in the 80s, it became, culture is arbitrary, and there are different choices we could make. The right almost conceded that culture is something that should be contested. They just began a very fervent fight for particular values, right? Yeah. They didn't suggest that America was value-less or value-neutral as they may, or culture was value-neutral as they may have in the 60s. Now they're saying, look, George Will's saying, look, we need Eurocentric stuff, or Dinesh D'Souza was saying, look, we need to push back against this stuff, or Mary Lefkowitz was saying, hey, Afrocentricity is garbage, it's a myth, right? The Malefi Asantes and et cetera on the other side, and Henry Louis Gates kind of playing in the middle. And you had all this stuff happening. My point is, now they're not making it as clear and earnest a claim that their values are better. It seems to me that right now it's happening under very different means. They're saying, oh, he's a socialist, or he's from Kenya, you know what that means, or he's a secret Muslim, you know what that means. Is there political room for the kind of honesty that existed in the 80s where George Will would write a column and say, you know what, European values are just better? You know, I mean, because there's some value to that kind of honesty, at least to the extent that we can contest it. We could write back to Mary Lefkowitz. We could write back to these people. Now it seems as if, because of the bounds of civility that you talk about, that it's hard to even have the conversation, because they're always in a state of perpetual denial that they're actually attacking anything on racial or ethnic ground.
Yeah, but I think that there's still a lot of those types of things that are coming out all the time, right? So wasn't it George Will who made the comment a little while ago about sexual assault? And so there are different kinds of things that are happening, and that they can still kind of catch fire and kind of move out. Michelle Malkin, right? The sort of concentration camp, the Japanese American concentration camp denier.
But don't they see like extremists now, though? I mean,
they do.
As opposed to the 80s and 90s, where the center of the conversation was this stuff.
They do, and so the ground has shifted, but at the same time, it's the debate is still there. Bill Maher, right, talking about Islam, right? So these are our culture wars that take different forms, of course, but it's still coming down to this ultimate division of narratives, right? The narrative of this great America that is about to fall into the complete abyss, the end of American civilization, versus the idea of an America that could be transformed into something great through the vitality of its peoples interacting. And again, this is the basis of conservative reaction now. It's about restoration, right? And people honestly and openly use the language of restoration. Sarah Palin saying, we can't allow our great country to be transformed. We must restore her and restore her values. And the really interesting thing about it is that conservatives actually don't ever have to do anything but argue for the status quo. What they have to do is to adapt to the new kinds of language that gets instilled when movements are able to make changes, right? So they in the 80s are using the language of the civil rights revolution, and now in some ways they have to adopt some of the language of the multiculturalists, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, they don't have to ever instill new visions. Those who are progressive and those who want change and racial progress always have to instill those new visions. And so it's always that extra burden that's added to us to be able to do that. And within the left, I think there's still an argument about quote-unquote identity politics, and certainly in the art world around identity art. And so those are different kinds of fronts that the culture wars are being fought on right now.
Absolutely. There's a level of optimism in your book that I needed, by the way. Yes. I finished the book feeling much more optimistic about the possibility of America, the possibility of us coming to terms with this stuff. But one question I had was, and it kind of goes back to the other point about the way in which we have to imagine a new world, a new self, a new nation, and that our culture, the art that we produce, can help bring that about. But the thing that kept nagging me as I read the book is, but to what extent is the opposite happening? To what extent is art overdetermined?
What do you mean by that?
By the moment. In other words, if I get how an Obama hope change poster might dare us and encourage us to imagine the world that is not yet in this new era of hope and change. But the flip of that is, to what extent does the current set of conditions, the current mode of production, the current economic realities, from neoliberalism to everything else, make us so constrained in our political imagination that Obama becomes the face of hope and change, a fairly centrist liberal, or maybe slightly to the left liberal, but certainly not the left that we dreamed of 40 years ago. To what extent is our political imagination constrained by the moment, so that the art itself
is constrained by the moment?
Exactly. So that we don't have Che on the wall no more. We got Obama. Because I'm imagining this generation of artists is also being limited in that way, or at least.
But I think that artists always overspill the cup, right? I guess maybe I'm optimistic in that kind of way.
Yeah.
That there are always visionaries who are going to kind of break the glass and sort of, kind of bring it home, so to speak. It's a line from one of the essays around the height of the culture wars. To take a hammer and crash the mirror and bring it home, just like make it authentic, make it real, make it relative to your experience that's happening. And I think that we've seen that around Ferguson. I think a lot of in hip hop, right?
Yeah,
a lot of the art that's been coming out, artists like Tef Poe, David Banner, like there's a shift that's kind of happening in the language that people are using now to be able to describe what's actually going on, what people's experiences are. Dear White People, Justin Simien, right? Yeah. Amazing movie, breaking through, I think, a lot of the noise around colorblindness and around race at this particular moment, and saying, here we are with all of these questions of visibility and invisibility, and we even have a foot in the door. One of the characters is a very high-ranking administrator in the university, which we couldn't have imagined, during the 80s and the 90s.
Right.
And his son is one of the key student activist characters in the movie. Here we are with all of this stuff going on, and yet we're still going to have situations in which there'll be racist incidents and parties that are going on. I don't want to give too much away of the movie. I think people ought to really see it.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's complicated. It's much more complicated than it was for us, probably.
Yeah.
And so I have no doubt that there'll be artists who will be able to make their statements, so to speak, to make their work, to have it appreciated for the formal values that they're instilling, as well as the messages that they're putting out at the same time.
How do we think about whiteness? Oftentimes when we talk about color, colorization, race, we're talking about everybody but white people. Right? How do in the 21st century do we come to terms with this thing called whiteness? Because I think that's a central piece of how we think about power and difference, et cetera, and identity politics.
Right. Well, I think that, again, the sort of conservatives have a very strong idea about how that should be conveyed, and it should be conveyed in terms of anxiety, in terms of fear. There was Time Magazine did a thing a couple years ago, 2010, where the top 10 ideas of the year, one of them was the white anxiety crisis, right? And then now you have Saturday Night Live that's parodying that a lot, but it's real, and I think that that's a force that's leading to things like, the new white flight to suburbs that are further and further out of the cities, this flight from multiculturalism, or this flight from the cities that have become, very diverse. So that's one vision that we have going on there. And I think the other vision, again, is of sort of liberal colorblindness. The idea that if we don't talk about it, it'll all go away. And I think that we need to build up and sort of elaborate on, well, what does it mean for us to be living in a society in which all of us are minorities? What it means is that we have to find the basis for a new majority. And that's a political question. It's a question that Republicans and Democrats are fighting out and figuring out every second of the day, right? Every second of every hour, every day, they're trying to figure that out. Right now, as we're going into even these midterm elections, and certainly going into 2016 and beyond. It's a political question in the party sense. It's a larger political question in terms of how do you form a new politic, a new sort of consensus around values of inclusion, desegregation, compassion, empathy, all those good ideas that we love so much.
But I think, to my whiteness question, I think a lot of that, though, that narrative, even of people who are fairly progressive, is about how we can be less biased to them, whoever them is, how we can give more stuff to them, create more access for them. There's a difference between that and being reflective, putting the mirror up and saying, what does it mean to be white? What does it mean to be in this position of power, to have this social location, this identity in 2014, particularly when it means something so radically different than it may have meant in 1914 or 1814.
Right.
You know, and so part of what I'm thinking about, particularly at this moment, is how do we create a conversation around what it means to be white, what it means to be the thing against which all other racial categories are measured, you know?
Yeah, and I think that has to do with having these honest conversations about privilege, where privilege comes from, what it means, how it gets instilled, how it passes through generations, how it gets recreated. Yeah. And to begin to dismantle those kinds of things, we have to have those honest conversations about it.
Yeah. Let's pivot to the kind of third moment. We've sort of already gotten there anyway. Okay, cool. But this later moment in the book, because one of the things that it forced me to think outside the bounds of is this black-white paradigm. Because, obviously, the racial demographics of the nation are changing for a variety of reasons. And so how we think and talk about race and racial difference has to become more diverse and more interesting. Talk to me about some of the factors that have made that the case. Why are we where we are right now?
Where are we where we are with
demographically?
With demographic.
Yeah, and even sort of culturally in terms of how we talk about racial difference. Because even the language of we are a majority-minority world is a very new kind of language.
Right.
You know.
Well, I think there's been an emerging sort of push to talk about and name anti-black racism, right? And I think that that's been a very positive and powerful push, because it's really important for us to be able to understand how certain races are used, how race is used, I should say it that way, how race is used to perpetuate anti-black racism specifically. And so for Asian Americans, for Latinos, to look at the ways in which we're talked about becomes a leverage to reinforce anti-black racism.
Give me an example.
Is really, really cool. So
like
a lot of minority, right, for Asian Americans, which has been ongoing. And I think now questions around mixed race children and youth and populations. In some ways, there's this sort of beautiful vision that if we all get busy with each other,
right,
that we all intermarry or we all have kids together, that the future will all be better, that racism will magically disappear.
Because race won't matter, because we'll all be the same thing.
Right, exactly. Like we'll never have these conversations anymore. And we only need to look at Brazil or where I'm from, Hawaii, to be able to kind of talk about the fact that discrimination still exists, that there are still these paradigms that are put into place that create inequalities that are long-standing and that continue. So, there's a lot of discussion that kind of needs to be had, and it gets much, much more complicated as we move forward. But I think that ultimately it has to be about this question of racial inequality. It's about closing these gaps. It's about closing the gaps around cultural inequity. It's about moving towards a society in which we are, again, all able to be free together. In order to do that, we have to imagine beyond ourselves, beyond our identities, to think about what the whole means. So I'll give you an example. In the Bay Area where I'm from, Asian American parents, to my chagrin, have been at the head of the movement to undo consent decrees in public schools, right? Apocalypse, especially in California, where all of the formerly excluded groups are going to begin fighting against each other. Right?
Kind of racial war of the worlds.
Racial war of the worlds, especially after the Los Angeles riots. This was like this apocalyptic thing. Like, don't follow multiculturalism at all, because that's leading you down a path towards balkanization and a divided country. It's going to be happening in the cities. It's going to be happening in the neighborhoods. It's going to be happening in the school boards, and that's not to minimize any of the tensions around change that are happening in different neighborhoods, because they are there. But there are also a lot of people of very goodwill in those neighborhoods who've been working together to try to find commonalities across different backgrounds and histories. And I think that that's the kind of stuff that we like to uplift as a model for us looking towards 2042.
One of the things that has been on the news for the last few months is ISIS. And it sparked this whole new conversation about Islam, this whole new conversation about difference.
Yeah.
You mentioned Bill Maher earlier even. And part of what I've been wondering is if this conversation about Islam becomes another way to address the race and color issue by different means. Because they're not thinking about German Muslims, they're not thinking about white Muslims, they're thinking about Arabs, they're thinking about South Asian, et cetera. To what extent do we have to sort of reimagine the sites of racial contests now? Because again, people aren't just saying keep the Arabs out. They're saying, oh, but these Muslims are dangerous. Islam is dangerous. Smuggling in a kind of racial critique. To what extent do we have to look new places as the demographic shifts happen, and it's not a black-white thing exclusively, and as these other issues begin to emerge in the front?
Yeah, a lot, absolutely. I think that what we see, especially after 2001, is this sort of heightened division around difference around religion. But then it gets racialized, as you just noted, because again, we're not talking about white Muslims for the most part. We're talking about Muslims of color. And entire neighborhoods have been wiped out where, you know, the policies of Homeland Security have gone in and uprooted and deported like thousands and thousands of Pakistani Americans, Bangladeshi Americans, South Asian Americans, Arab Americans. Entire neighborhoods have been torn apart by these different types of policies. This, again, is one of the things that's in our blind spot, right? Because I'm a huge fan of name your favorite athlete, I can't be racist, but don't let me sit next to somebody on the subway, you know, wearing a hijab. It's crazy. And so we do have to absolutely rethink how it looks in the 21st century. And these are the kinds of things that I think I'm talking about when I'm talking about sort of neighborhoods kind of coming together, folks coming together across, you know, different kinds of backgrounds, and saying, no, we're not actually going to stand for that. Yes, these are people in our neighborhood. Yes, we are all in this together. And to move forward. But you know, the question is so difficult when you really kind of get down to the heart of it. We kind of have to get beyond all of these questions of what Martin Luther King called, you know, the great three triplets, right? Racism, militarism, and economic inequality. In order to get to the kind of society that frees us all. And we're always dealing with all of this noise that we're getting. And so what I guess I'm saying is, in the lack of people like you and I, or people in any kind of neighborhood, any kind of setting, the church, the cafe, the schoolyard, having these conversations, what happens is the extremists begin to dominate the conversation. Right? And this is what I'm labeling, you know, the culture wars. The culture wars exist because we are not having these movements at the ground level, below, you know, the surface of what's visible on 24-hour cable.
Well, one place where those conversations are beginning to emerge, I think, again, is TV.
And Twitter.
And
strange places like that.
For sure. I'm just thinking about cultural like images at the moment, because I agree with you about social media, but I'm thinking about a show like Blackish. I'm thinking about Black Jesus on Adult Swim. I'm thinking about these kind of edgy, dangerous representations. In the book, you talk about even the Boondocks as being kind of parodic at this moment, saying that, you know, they see racial diversity and multiculturalism as something to parody, which is its own kind of politics. Are you do the images that you see now make you more encouraged about our ability to have those kinds of conversations, the edgy ones, the dangerous ones, the ones that go deeper than the kind of civil, bourgeois liberal ones that we often have?
I'm ambivalent. I'm really ambivalent, and I think anybody who's reading the book will kind of see that. It's really interesting that ABC's fall lineup, right, has a focus on non-white families and, you know, non-white leads, folks of color who are leads. And in some respects, it's an understanding that demographics have shifted, right? And again, this is sort of something that we.
I like that you're entering my cynicalville now a little bit, right?
Well, okay, so I'm gonna be ambivalent here, right?
Okay.
So Fox TV, when it was trying to establish itself as the fourth network, right, decided that, like Pepsi actually before that, Pepsi-Cola before that, you know, they were behind, they had to catch up. How are they going to do that? Well, we're going to go after youth, we're going to go after communities of color, right? We're going to build a business from the niches as opposed to the number one Coke, right? Or NBC at the time that had, you know, the big audiences. We're going to build up a whole number of niches, right? So Fox did that. They had The Simpsons, they had In Living Color, they had all of, on and on. They had all of these shows that were bringing in these new audiences. And folks were saying, wow, this isn't golden age. This is a golden age of black TV. As soon as Fox TV gets the NFL, they dropped all the shows, right? And so I'm cynical in that sense, right? Like, how long will this last? We know that Scandal did really well. Let's go and add, you know, all these other types of shows and see kind of where they go. How long will it last? I don't know how long it's going to last. It might be a concession right now at this particular point during the latter years of the Obama presidency, right, to shore up these audiences. Or it could be a permanent type of move. And then how far can those representations go is I think, the relevant question. So I'm ambivalent about that. But at the same time, I'm happy, right? There's the old sort of fighting, you know, fist in the air multiculturalist in me who's like, representation. Like, I'm happy that Eddie Huang's got a show now. I want to see FOB more than I want to see pretty much any other show on TV now. Because I'm thinking, wow, this is something that I might be able to actually recognize. And representation and recognition is always really important.
So you're a cultural historian. So you, I gotta push back against your optimism, your overarching optimism, even in the midst of the concession of cynicism on this point. Because you look across history, and you see where we've been, and in the book you talk about the structural stuff. I mean, in a very substantive and nuanced way. We're in a jacked up spot politically, economically.
We are, absolutely.
And yet, at the end of the book, you reiterate, drawing from King and Grace Lee Boggs and all this, you reiterate just how hopeful you are as one of their children that we are going to be able to imagine and produce a world that, in my estimation, there's no evidence for it. I might share your optimism, but deep down I might share that optimism. But I want to know where you get it from, because the book to me talks about just how complicated and messy this stuff is, and yet you retrieve out of that mess a sense of hope.
Look, people talk about changing demographics. I could tell you about Chang demographics. Okay, I come from a Chinese Hawaiian family. I'm married into a Filipino family. And by now, our clans have intermarried with just about everybody possible. You know what I mean? So we have these grand reunions all the time. Lots of hanging out, lots of fun. And this is what my kids have grown up around, right? It's what I grew up around, really. And I see that happening. You know, it's not like, you know, this person and that person don't have a fight that they've been nursing for 20 years, maybe, right? It's not that there's all, you know, sort of peace and love through the whole thing. There's hard conversations that people are having, I'm sure, in the corners and that kind of thing, or maybe they're using it as an opportunity to reconnect or that kind of thing. But that's real. That's my reality, right? People talk about getting to 2042. That's been my reality ever since I was born. And so maybe that's where I get it from, you know, on a personal kind of way.
Because it's just through the book.
But we have to, I mean, we have to. We have to figure this out. Like, do we want to get to a point where we've got a majority-minority society, but the grand experiment has failed, and we're no longer talking about class and race and gender. We're talking about caste, right? And we're talking about a permanent inside and a permanent outside. And so I wouldn't like to see that. I wouldn't like to see that for us. I wouldn't like to see that for my kids. I wouldn't like to see that for my grandkids. I'd like to see a better world.
Well, I'm going to ask you to make two predictions.
I'm not really good at predictions.
The first one you'll be good at, I promise. The second one, maybe not, but the first one you'll be good at because I'm only asking you to predict 2016. So how will the shifting racial demographics inform the election of the next president?
I think that it's going to be a really, really interesting contest. I think that the Republicans have to remake themselves. I think the Democrats as well are going to have to figure out, after Obama, how they attract the constituencies that Obama brought into the fold.
Yeah.
And
which ones though? Because black folk vote Democrat anyway.
Yeah, but if black, it's like Cornell Belcher was saying the other week, right? If black turnout is low, that's going to make the difference, right? If Latino turnout is low, if Asian American turnout is low, if gay lesbian turnout is low, if all the young people's turnout is low, then the Democrats are pretty much where they started before 2007, right? And so all of that is real. And again, these are mathematical calculations. It's not what I'm really interested in the end. Yeah. It's not really what I mean when I'm talking about trying to build a new cultural majority.
Yeah. But it matters to the extent that the people who are making political decisions can undermine the type of cultural values and type of cultural plurality and diversity that we do want to see, as they have in the 60s and 80s and 2000s, et cetera.
But as you know, to take up your sort of cynical kind of mind state on this, even if we are able to create that coalition that will propel somebody into office, will we still be moving towards those kinds of cultural values that we want to instill in order to move us towards a better society? I'm not sure. Yeah. The question's certainly been very mixed and complicated with Obama's presidency.
Yeah. That brings me to my other crystal ball request. Indulge me. All right. 2042. Yeah. That magic year.
Right. The year it all goes to hell.
Yeah. Exactly. What do we have to do to get to what needs to happen for us to be in the kind of place that you ideally imagine us to be and that you sort of imagine with us in the book?
We have to get to our blind spots. We have to understand that we really have to rethink the kind of divisions and segregation, that's happening below the surface, and how we address that. We have to attack resegregation. We have to attack these gaps. Again, the numbers are stark, and many of us know the numbers about the folks of color behind bars, right? Many of us understand the numbers around the educational gap, right? I think less of us necessarily may understand the wealth gap and the income gap, the racial wealth gap and the racial income gap, but those are really pressing. I think recent studies have shown that if we try to make the kind of progress that we're making around the race gap, the race wealth gap now, it would take us, more than a century really to get to the point where folks would be near to being equal. Yeah. And so these are the kinds of issues that we have to address in a very, very, measured, nuanced, and devoted, committed kind of way.
My last question is the one I probably should have asked you first.
Okay.
What is it about artists? What is it about culture, which you describe as kind of soft, malleable, that allows us to get at this stuff sometimes in more substantive and rigorous ways than the greatest intellectuals or the greatest philosophers and treatises?
Well, part of it owes to the artistic process. The political process brings it down to questions of should this bill be written where the cutoff of the age is going to be 62 or 59. Yeah. The questions are very narrow. With the artistic process, the questions are much broader and they can kind of cascade down. And so what the artists bring to the table is the ability to be able to ask the impertinent, the wrong, but ultimately right questions that need to be asked of us, of our society.
Wow. Well, art certainly does that, and this book certainly does that, man. It's an amazing book. I loved Can't Stop, Won't Stop, and you have upped the intellectual stakes once again with Who We Be, man. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.